The phone rings in the dead of night, breaking the silence with a voice from Emily's past. Michael, a man she thought had disappeared years ago. As the voice whispers familiar words, the tension builds, and a chilling memory begins to resurface. "You left me, Emily," it says, sending waves of dread through her. But Michael isn't supposed to be alive. The more she listens, the more it feels like a forgotten piece of her life is clawing its way back. What has she forgotten? And why is someone reminding her now, in the dead of night? The phone rang. It was late, the kind of late that seeps into your bones, a time where the world is dark and the air feels colder. The kind of hour where every sound is amplified. The muffled hum of the refrigerator, the soft rustle of the trees outside, even the faint tap of the distant clock ticking on. A time where any noise, any movement, feels like a threat lurking just out of sight. She glanced at the screen. A known number. Her first instinct was to ignore it. She didn't know anyone who would be calling this late. Still, the ringing persisted, piercing the quiet room like a whisper too loud to ignore. With a heavy sigh, she picked up the phone, held it to her ear. "Hello." There was a brief silence on the other end, the kind that made her stomach tighten with unease. Then came the voice, a voice she knew all too well. But it wasn't supposed to be calling her, not like this. Not at this hour. The voice was calm, almost serene, but there was something off about it. Something unsettling. "Hello," she repeated, her voice shakier than she intended. "Who is this?" The voice on the other end of the line didn't answer her question. Instead, it said something she hadn't expected. A name. Her name. First and last, clear as day, as if it had been sitting on the tip of the caller's tongue for years. "Erica, it's been a while." Her breath hitched. Her heart rate picked up, like a sudden jolt of adrenaline coursing through her veins. She froze. The name felt like it came from deep within her, like a memory that didn't belong in the present, but was resurfacing unbidden. The voice was a stranger, yet it carried a familiarity that set her on edge. "Who is this?" she asked again, a little more forcefully now. But the caller remained calm, their voice unwavering. "You don't remember me, do you?" The voice was soft but heavy with something she couldn't quite place. It didn't seem angry, but it didn't seem friendly either. It was a voice that stirred something in her, something buried deep. Her mind raced. She had no recollection of this voice. But there was a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the kind that comes when something feels wrong, when a door is opened to a memory you don't want to face. She strained to place it, her thoughts spinning, but nothing came. Nothing that could explain why she felt as though she'd been expecting this call, as though it had been inevitable. The silence stretched, and for a moment, she almost hung up, convinced that it was a prank. But then the voice spoke again, this time with more intent, and everything in her body screamed to pay attention. It was too deliberate, too knowing. "I've been watching you, Erica." The words hit her like a slap to the face. Her stomach churned, and she felt the blood rush to her ears. She sat up straighter, gripping the phone tighter, as though it might slip away from her. The feeling in the pit of her stomach was no longer just unease, it was fear. Raw, primal fear. What do you want?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a long pause. The kind that made her want to tear the phone away from her ear and throw it across the room. She could feel her pulse racing in her throat, every second stretching on forever. The silence was maddening, a quiet that seemed to suffocate the air around her. "I know everything, Erica," the voice continued. "I know where you are. I know what you've done. I know everything about you." Her skin prickled. She didn't know whether she was supposed to be terrified or intrigued, but one thing was certain, her instincts were screaming at her to hang up. To just disconnect from this madness. But her hand didn't move. Her body was frozen in place, as though something was preventing her from acting, as if some invisible force had her locked in that moment. "Who are you?" Her voice cracked, despite her attempt to sound confident. "How do you know all of this?" The voice didn't respond immediately. It was like they were savoring the fear in her voice, savoring the panic that was growing inside her with every passing second. Then, just as she thought she might lose her mind, the voice spoke again, this time with a chilling sense of finality. You don't remember me, do you? How could you? It's been so long. A shiver ran down her spine. This time, it wasn't the voice that made her afraid, it was the implication behind it. A vague sense of recognition was starting to take root, but she couldn't place it. She couldn't piece together the jigsaw puzzle that was forming in her mind. But the voice wasn't finished. Not yet. I'm the one who saved you, they said softly. The one you forgot. The one who was always there. She closed her eyes, trying to grasp at anything familiar, trying to catch the fragments of memory that seemed to be slipping just out of reach. Saved her from what? She had no recollection of any event that could connect her to this voice. You saved me, she repeated, the words tasting foreign on her tongue. I don't understand. The silence stretched longer this time, until it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, the kind where you can almost hear your heartbeat pounding in your chest. And then, just as the tension felt like it might snap, the voice spoke again, this time with a sense of finality that chilled her to the bone. You will remember, the voice said, their tone a mixture of promise and warning. You will remember everything, soon. The line went dead. She stood there, the phone still pressed to her ear, the weight of the call settling over her like a heavy fog. It took her a moment to process what had just happened. Her hands were trembling, the phone slipping slightly from her grip. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Who had that been? Why did they know her name? How did they know about things she hadn't told anyone? Her thoughts were spinning, each one more frantic than the last. She wasn't even sure if she was scared of the caller, or of the fact that she didn't remember anything that could explain this. There was a gnawing feeling inside her, something tugging at the edges of her consciousness, something she couldn't reach. Something that felt like a memory, but one that had been buried so deep, so long ago, that it was impossible to recall. She looked at her phone, her thumb hovering over the call history. But even as she considered checking it, she hesitated. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. What if the number was something familiar? What if the truth was something she wasn't ready to face? The sound of the wind outside picked up, a soft howling as it brushed against the windows. The room felt colder now, despite the warmth of the lamp glowing softly beside her. She set the phone down slowly, her eyes scanning the room, half expecting someone to be watching her. The feeling of being watched lingered, thick and suffocating. She wanted to scream, to run. But all she could do was sit there, feeling the creeping dread crawl under her skin. It wasn't just a phone call. It was a message. And the question that kept repeating in her mind was one that she couldn't escape. What had she forgotten? And why was someone reminding her now? The phone rang again. It was the kind of sound that cut through the stillness of the night like a blade through soft fabric. This time, she didn't hesitate. Her hand reached for the phone instinctively, the glow from the screen illuminating her tired face. She had already been trying to ignore the nagging feeling that had taken root inside her for the last few hours. The unsettling conversation earlier that evening, the voice on the other end of the line, it hadn't let her rest. Her thumb hovered over the screen, checking the number again. No name. No identification. Just an unknown number that now seemed so familiar. She shouldn't have answered. She knew that. But somehow, it felt like she had no choice. It was as if the ringing was pulling her in, like the call was meant for her, for only her. Hello. Her voice came out softer than she intended, almost hesitant. She hadn't expected to hear anything again. Hadn't expected that voice to be back so soon. But it was. This time, it didn't start with a name. There was no Erica this time. Just silence. The kind of silence that hangs between words, heavy and suffocating, filling the air with an unbearable tension. She waited, and the seconds stretched into minutes. She could hear her own breathing, shallow and quick, as she gripped the phone tighter, waiting for the voice to break the silence. Finally, a voice emerged, but it wasn't quite the same. It was lower, hushed, as if the speaker didn't want anyone to hear. But that was what terrified her. The voice, now almost a whisper, seemed too familiar. Too intimate. Erica, do you remember me? The words were quiet, almost too quiet, as though they were meant to slip past her defenses without her noticing. She swallowed hard. The question hit her like a jolt of cold water. Her pulse quickened, blood rushing to her ears. This wasn't the same voice from before. But it was close. Too close. She didn't know how to answer. She had no idea who this person was, but the voice, it stirred something in her. A memory, just beyond her reach. Something buried deep inside her mind. "I don't understand," she said, her voice shaking. "Who is this?" The voice paused again, and she could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her, making the room feel smaller, colder. The only sound now was the soft rustling of the wind outside, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock on the wall. Nothing to distract her from the tension, the creeping dread that seemed to grow with every second that passed. "I know you don't understand," the voice finally said, almost sounding apologetic. "But I need you to remember. I need you to remember everything." Her breath caught in her throat. "Remember what? For you." The words tumbled out before she could stop them, but they hung in the air, unanswered, like an unspoken invitation to something she couldn't fully comprehend. Something that made her want to retreat. To run. "You don't recognize my voice, do you?" The voice asked, a hint of sadness creeping into its tone. "I thought you would. After all, I was there. I was there when you needed me most." She felt her stomach twist. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the words, trying to connect them to something, anything, from her past. But it was like trying to hold on to water. Everything slipped through her fingers. She could feel the coldness of the air on her skin, the hairs on her neck standing on end. The tension in the room was palpable, suffocating. "I don't know who you are," she whispered, though her words sounded weak, even to her own ears. "Please tell me." The voice was quiet again, and the silence seemed to stretch on forever. She could hear her heartbeat, the slow, rhythmic thump in her chest, as though the room itself was holding its breath. "I was there, Erica. I saved you." Her heart skipped a beat. The words seemed to echo in her mind, reverberating in her skull. "Saved me from what?" Her voice cracked slightly, the fear in it unmistakable now. There was a long pause before the voice spoke again, its tone darkening, thick with something she couldn't quite place. "You don't remember?" The voice sounded almost disappointed now. "I guess it's true what they say. The mind can forget things. Especially things it can't handle." Her mind was reeling. A flood of emotions washed over her, emotions she couldn't name. Anxiety, confusion, fear. The questions piled up, unanswered, and the uncertainty gnawed at her insides. What did the voice mean? What had it saved her from? Who was this person, this stranger, who seemed to know so much about her? I don't remember anything like that." Her voice trembled as she spoke, her grip tightening on the phone. "You will," the voice replied, its tone now more forceful, more commanding. "You will remember soon enough. When the time is right." A chill swept through her, colder than anything she had ever felt before. It was like the temperature in the room had dropped, the air turning thick and heavy, suffocating her. She felt a sudden urge to hang up, to disconnect, to erase the connection between her and the voice on the other end of the line. But something stopped her. Something deep inside her told her that if she hung up now, she might lose the only chance she had to understand what was going on. But the silence returned, and this time it felt different. It felt like it was stretching, wrapping around her, suffocating her. She was alone in her apartment, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was watching her. She could almost feel their eyes on her, piercing through the walls, the air, the distance between them. A shiver ran down her spine. "What do you want from me?" Her voice was small now, almost a whisper, as if speaking any louder would break the fragile barrier between herself and whatever force was behind this call. The voice seemed to consider her question for a moment, and then, almost lazily, it replied. "I want you to remember. I want you to remember everything, Erica. All the things you've forgotten. All the things you've buried." The words were sharp, jagged, like a knife being twisted into her mind. She recoiled. She didn't want to remember. Whatever this was, she didn't want to be a part of it. But the voice wasn't done. It never was. "You'll remember when it's time. You'll remember when you see him again." The sentence hung in the air, lingering long after the voice had fallen silent. She held the phone to her ear, trembling, her heart racing. The words reverberated in her mind, repeating over and over again, "You'll remember when you see him again." Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it, trying to make sense of anything. Who was the him the voice was talking about? Why was it so important? And then, as though to drive the point home, the phone call disconnected. The line went dead, leaving her standing there in the growing silence, the phone still pressed against her ear. She could still hear the faint ringing in her ears, the echo of the words, the promise of something to come. She stared at the phone in her hand, a sick feeling settling in her stomach. For the first time that night, Erica realized that the nightmare she was living wasn't a dream. It was something much worse. The phone rang again, and this time, there was no hesitation in her movements. Her hand reached for the device before the first ring had even ended. She wasn't sure what made her answer. It was almost like she had no control over the action anymore. The ringing had become a constant, a reminder that something was coming, something inevitable, something she couldn't ignore. She almost didn't care who was calling now, but she couldn't bring herself to leave it unanswered either. Maybe she was too curious. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the odd sense of déjà vu that kept pulling her in. She glanced at the screen, her fingers trembling just slightly as she saw the words, "Unknown caller." Her mind screamed at her to stop, to not pick up, to just let it ring out like every other call. But her thumb slid over the screen, and the call connected. "Hello." Her voice came out dry, almost mechanical, like it didn't even belong to her. She had already answered twice tonight, but something about this call felt different. She had no way of knowing why, but deep inside, a part of her was bracing itself for something far worse than before. There was an unsettling tension in the air, something thick and oppressive. It felt as though the room itself was waiting for her to speak, waiting for this call to unfold. There was no immediate response. Just silence. Her pulse quickened, a wave of discomfort washing over her as the seconds dragged on. The longer the silence stretched, the more suffocating it became. It felt wrong. The air felt wrong, too still, too silent, like someone was holding their breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Then, just as the silence began to gnaw at her, a voice emerged. Soft, familiar, but distant. A voice she hadn't heard in years, and yet it cut through her like a jagged shard of glass. It didn't start with her name. No. It was something deeper, something more unsettling. "Why did you leave me, Erica?" The words sent a chill through her spine, freezing her in place. Her breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't heard that voice in so long, but she would never forget it. Her eyes widened, her hand instinctively tightening around the phone as the reality of who was speaking hit her. It was a voice she hadn't thought of in years, too long in fact. It was the voice of someone she had lost. Someone she had walked away from. But how? How was this even possible? "Who is this?" she asked, trying to steady her shaking hands. The voice sounded like it was speaking from a great distance, from a place outside time and space. But there was a familiarity in it that made her feel as though she was being pulled into something she couldn't escape. The voice didn't answer right away. Instead, it repeated the question. The one question that had been hanging in the air all night, but this time, it came with a twist, an accusation. "Why did you leave me, Erica?" Her stomach twisted. She wanted to hang up. She wanted to scream. She wanted to disconnect from whatever this was, but the words stuck to her chest, making her feel like she couldn't breathe. She couldn't ignore it, couldn't pretend that everything was fine. That voice, it wasn't just a memory, it was something alive, something connected to her past in ways she wasn't ready to face. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're supposed to be dead." The words felt like they didn't belong to her. She didn't want to say them, didn't want to acknowledge the truth that she had buried deep down for so long. But they slipped out, unbidden, because there was no escaping it now. The voice on the other end didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. It didn't even sound surprised. Instead, it grew colder, sharper, like a blade pressing against her skin. "I'm not dead, Erica," the voice said, each word laced with an eerie calmness that sent a shudder down her spine. "You killed me." The weight of those words hit her like a ton of bricks. Her breath caught in her throat. Her entire body went cold. She didn't know if she could breathe anymore. Killed me? What did that even mean? It didn't make sense. She hadn't killed anyone. Had she? What do you mean? She could barely get the words out, each one more difficult to speak than the last. Her mind was racing, but the thoughts weren't making any sense. Who are you? What are you talking about? There was a long pause on the other end, and for a moment she thought the call had dropped, but then the voice returned, colder than before. You know exactly who I am, Erica. Don't pretend you don't. You remember what happened. You remember what you did. You remember how you left me behind. The words felt like they were twisting into her thoughts, making her question everything she had ever known. How could she remember something like that? She had no memory of what they were talking about. No memory of killing anyone, of leaving someone behind. Yet, the more the voice spoke, the more it seemed to crack open something in her, something dark and buried. It was like a wall inside her mind was beginning to crumble, bit by bit, and the floodgates were starting to open. No, she whispered, shaking her head even though she knew no one could see her. That's not true. You're wrong. You must be wrong. But deep down, a part of her wasn't so sure anymore. The feeling that had settled in her stomach, the fear that had been growing since the first call, it was all tied to something she couldn't remember. Something she didn't want to remember. The voice continued, unrelenting, unyielding. You left me, Erica. You left me, and now I'm coming for you. You can't run from what you did. You can't hide. Her heart began to race in her chest. It felt like it was about to burst through her ribs. She was frozen in place, unable to tear herself away from the conversation, even though every instinct in her body screamed to hang up. The air around her was thick with dread. Her entire body felt heavy, weighed down by something she couldn't explain. Please, she gasped, her voice breaking as she spoke. I don't know what you're talking about. Please just tell me who you are. The voice didn't respond right away, but she could feel it coming, the final words that would finish this nightmare. She could sense it, could almost hear it in the way the air around her seemed to grow thicker, colder. I'm the one you left behind, Erica. And now, you'll never be free. Before she could respond, the line went dead. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the phone in her hand, still pressed to her ear as if waiting for the call to return, for the voice to speak again. But it didn't. The silence that followed felt even worse than the conversation had been. It was a quiet that wrapped around her like a heavy shroud, smothering her. The room, once so familiar, felt alien, suffocating. She couldn't bring herself to move. Couldn't bring herself to do anything but listen to the pounding of her own heart, each beat echoing in her ears. Her fingers trembled as she lowered the phone. She had to face it. She couldn't run from it anymore. There was something in her past, something she had buried so deeply that she had convinced herself it didn't matter, something she had forgotten, or chosen to forget. She wasn't sure she was ready to remember. But one thing was clear now, the past was coming back for her, and there was no escaping it. The house felt unnaturally quiet. The kind of silence that presses down on you, filling the space with a weight that's hard to ignore. It wasn't the peaceful quiet she'd been used to when living alone. It was a silence that seemed to pulse, like the air itself was holding its breath. Emily stood in her kitchen, staring out the window into the dark yard, her hands still holding the phone she had just hung up. The call had rattled her to her core, and the tension in her body was starting to feel unbearable. It had been years since she'd last heard from him. She could still remember the night he disappeared as though it had happened only yesterday. The confusion, the frantic search, the feeling of her heart sinking as the days passed with no word, no trace. No one had ever found him, and the authorities had long since stopped looking. His disappearance had become one of those unsolved mysteries that people whispered about but never truly discussed. And yet, here she was, standing alone in her house, the ghost of his voice echoing in her mind, almost like he had never really left. Emily, the voice had said, and it sent a chill down her spine. It was a voice she hadn't heard in years, but she could never forget it. Michael's voice. The name he had called her by, the way it used to sound when they were together. But that was impossible. He was gone. Everyone knew that. No one had seen him since that night. His body had never been found. She had convinced herself that whatever happened to him, whatever dark force had taken him, was something she would never understand. Yet the voice on the phone had shattered that illusion. It wasn't just a random call. It was him. Or at least it sounded like him. As the evening dragged on, Emily found it impossible to focus on anything. She tried to get back to work, tried to immerse herself in her emails and the mundane tasks that filled her day-to-day, but the words on the screen seemed to blur together. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the call. The way his voice had been so familiar, yet so distant. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. The words kept replaying in her mind like a broken record, each one cutting deeper than the last. "I'm not dead, Emily." The thought lingered in her mind, refusing to leave. She found herself pacing the small living room, the old hardwood floors creaking beneath her as she tried to make sense of it all. Her fingers tapped restlessly against the arm of the couch, her legs restless as they carried her in circles. Had it really been Michael? Had it been him calling from beyond the grave? Or was it some twisted prank, someone with an uncanny ability to mimic his voice? But deep down she knew. She knew it wasn't a prank. That voice was his. She could feel it in her bones, in the pit of her stomach, that unmistakable connection to the past. The kind of bond you never forget. She had buried that bond for so long, locked it away in a place so deep inside her that she had nearly convinced herself it was gone forever. But now it was clawing its way back to the surface, and she didn't know what to do with it. Hours passed. Emily sat by the window, her gaze wandering to the dark sky outside, her mind a jumbled mess of thoughts and emotions. What was the point of it all? If Michael was still out there, if he was still alive, then why hadn't he contacted her before? Why wait all these years, only to call her in the dead of night, speaking in riddles and cryptic messages? There was no way of knowing the answer, no way of understanding why this was happening now, why it had to happen at all. And that terrified her more than anything. The fear, however, was starting to give way to something else, a creeping sense of dread. What if he wasn't the one who had called her? What if it was someone, or something else? The thought was enough to make her skin crawl. She had never been one to believe in supernatural occurrences, in ghosts or spirits. But the more she thought about the call, the more her rational mind began to splinter. She couldn't explain it, but the sensation in her gut told her this wasn't just some prank or mistake. This was something far darker. Something far more dangerous. She hadn't told anyone about the call yet. Not her friends, not her family. She had tried to rationalize it, tried to explain away the strange feeling that had clung to her since she had heard Michael's voice. But as the days went by, the feeling only deepened. There were moments when she would hear a noise, something small, a knock on the door, a creak of the floorboards, and her heart would skip a beat. She would freeze, waiting for the next sign, for something, anything, that would tell her whether she was going insane or whether this was real. The paranoia was beginning to take root. She caught herself glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to be there. Sometimes she would hear whispers on the edge of her hearing, voices too soft to make out. The wind would howl outside, and she would imagine it was him, Michael, calling her name, taunting her, beckoning her to come closer. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thoughts, trying to remind herself that none of this made sense. But the fear, the uncertainty, wouldn't go away. It was a feeling she had never been able to shake, and now it was consuming her. On the fourth day after the call, she couldn't take it any longer. She had to know. She had to find out if there was any truth to what he had said, or if it was all just some horrible, twisted illusion. She sat in her living room, the phone in her hand, staring at the numbers she had long since erased. The temptation to dial his number, to call the number that had once been his, was overwhelming. But a part of her was terrified of what would happen if she did. What if he picked up? What if it was really him on the other end? But there was another part of her, the part that had been longing for answers for so long, that couldn't resist. She dialed the number. The phone rang, each ring like a countdown, a ticking clock that seemed to echo in her ears. She held her breath as she waited, praying that it would go to voicemail, that she wouldn't have to face the possibility that this was real. But then the call connected. Hello. Her heart stopped. It wasn't Michael's voice. It wasn't the familiar tone she had heard so many times in her youth. It wasn't the warm, comforting voice that had once called her name in love and laughter. No, it was a stranger's voice. Cold. Detached. And the words that followed made her blood run cold. You shouldn't have called, Emily, the voice said. Now you've awakened something you can't put back to sleep. Her grip on the phone tightened, her knuckles white with the pressure. Who is this? She demanded, her voice shaking despite herself. The voice on the other end chuckled. You'll find out soon enough. And with that, the line went dead. Emily stared at the phone in her hand, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in on her. The shadow of doubt had transformed into something far more tangible. This wasn't just about Michael anymore. It never had been. Something had been waiting for her. Something she couldn't escape. The night air was thick with tension, each breath she took feeling heavier than the last. Emily stood in the middle of her living room, the phone still clutched tightly in her hand, her mind racing with the weight of what had just happened. The line had gone dead abruptly, the voice on the other end as chilling as it was cryptic. You've awakened something you can't put back to sleep. The words replayed in her mind over and over, each time sinking deeper into her thoughts, gnawing at the edges of her sanity. She could feel the cold sweat on her skin, the fine hairs on her arms standing on end, as though she were being watched. It was a sensation that had been with her ever since she'd received the first phone call, a growing unease that refused to go away. Her gaze drifted toward the door, the silence of her apartment now oppressive, each sound, a creak in the floorboards, the soft hum of the refrigerator, seeming to echo in her ears. The house, once a place of comfort, felt foreign now, like a trap that she couldn't escape. She had always been alone here, but never had it felt so isolating, so claustrophobic. The weight of the unknown pressed against her, suffocating her with every passing second. What was happening? What had she gotten herself into? The thought of going to the police crossed her mind, but she dismissed it almost immediately. Who would believe her? The authorities had given up on Michael's disappearance years ago. They had written it off as a cold case, an unsolved mystery that no one had the answers to. And even if she told them about the calls, about the voice that sounded so much like him, what would they think? That she was losing her mind? That she had finally cracked under the pressure of years of unanswered questions? Emily sank into the couch, the weight of exhaustion settling into her bones. She had no idea how long she had been pacing, her thoughts running wild, her mind teetering on the edge of madness. The phone call had shattered the fragile sense of normalcy she had managed to piece together in the years since Michael's disappearance. The idea that he might still be alive, that he might still be out there, was both a relief and a terrifying possibility. But if he wasn't alive, if this wasn't him, then what in the world was going on? Who was playing this sick game with her, and why? She ran her hands through her hair, her fingers trembling. The air in the room seemed colder now, the shadows stretching long and eerie across the walls. She had to make sense of this. She had to find answers. But where did she even begin? She couldn't just keep waiting for the phone to ring again. She couldn't sit in this house, consumed by fear, unable to move or think clearly. She needed to act. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat and headed out the door. The cold hit her immediately, the brisk night air biting at her skin as she made her way down the stairs of her apartment building. The streets were empty, the only sounds the distant hum of passing cars and the rustle of leaves in the wind. It was a quiet night, the kind of night where nothing seemed to move except the shadows. But to Emily, the night felt alive, pulsing with a strange energy, as if something was just out of sight, waiting for her to turn the corner, to step into its grasp. She didn't know where she was going, but her feet carried her anyway, moving on autopilot. The city, familiar and comforting by day, now felt alien and unsettling in the dark. Every corner she turned seemed to bring her deeper into the unknown, deeper into the labyrinth of her own fear. The streets she had once walked with ease now felt like a maze, every shadow hiding something sinister, every whisper of the wind a warning. Her thoughts turned back to the phone call. The voice had been clear, but the message it carried was still shrouded in mystery. You've awakened something you can't put back to sleep. What did that mean? Who or what was she dealing with? Was it really Michael? Was it him, somehow reaching out from the other side? Or was it someone, or something else entirely? The questions swirled in her mind as she walked aimlessly through the empty streets. She tried to make sense of the fragmented pieces of the puzzle, but it was like trying to fit together a jigsaw without a picture to guide her. There was no clear answer, no simple solution. Just the gnawing sense that she was standing on the edge of something much larger than herself. Something that, once awakened, would never let her go. The sound of footsteps behind her brought her to an abrupt stop. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned, half expecting to see a figure emerging from the shadows. But the street was empty. There was no one there. Just the echo of her own breath and the distant hum of the city. She shook her head, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched, but it wouldn't go away. The fear had settled into her bones, deep and unshakable. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't outrun it. The footsteps came again, louder this time, closer. She froze, her blood turning cold. There was no one in sight. No one following her. And yet, the sound persisted, like the steady rhythm of someone trailing just out of view. Without thinking, she broke into a run, her footsteps pounding against the pavement as she rushed down the street. Her mind raced, her pulse quickening as the fear pushed her forward. She didn't know what she was running from, but she couldn't stop. The sound of her footsteps, the echo of something, or someone, chasing her, drove her onward, faster and faster, until her legs burned with the effort. Finally, she reached a small park, the trees casting long, skeletal shadows across the grass. She stopped, gasping for breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see a figure emerging from the darkness, but there was nothing. The park was empty. The only sounds were the wind and the distant hum of traffic. She was alone. Her breath slowed as she tried to calm herself, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She hadn't imagined the footsteps. She couldn't have. And yet, there was no one behind her. No one in sight. It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense anymore. And then, as she turned to leave the park, her phone vibrated in her pocket. Her heart skipped again, a fresh wave of fear rushing through her veins. She pulled the phone from her pocket, her fingers trembling as she glanced at the screen. An unknown number. She hesitated for a moment, the phone vibrating in her hand like it was alive. It was a sickening feeling, the way it seemed to pulse with the same fear that had gripped her all night. But she knew she had to answer. She had no choice. "Hello." Her voice was barely above a whisper, her breath catching in her throat. The voice on the other end was soft, almost a whisper itself. But it was unmistakable. "Emily," the voice said, as cold and familiar as ever. "You shouldn't have gone looking for answers. You've already disturbed what was never meant to be disturbed." The words sent a jolt of terror through her, her heart racing once more. She had been right all along. There was something here, something far darker than she had ever imagined. And it was coming for her. The phone call ended abruptly, just as before. Emily stood frozen in place, the screen of her phone dimming in her trembling hands. The voice had spoken again, its message no clearer, no less chilling. "You've already disturbed what was never meant to be disturbed." She didn't understand it. She couldn't make sense of it. Who was this voice? What did it want? And why was it so desperate to keep her from uncovering the truth? A sinking feeling pressed against her chest, as though her own breath was being squeezed from her body. She looked around, the shadows of the park around her suddenly feeling larger, more menacing. The wind rustled the trees, but the sound felt almost mocking, like the world itself was laughing at her confusion, her helplessness. She was being toyed with. She could feel it deep in her gut. Whoever, or whatever, was behind these calls, they knew exactly what they were doing. They were playing with her mind, pulling her further into this twisted game, and she had no idea how to escape. The thought of returning home crossed her mind, but that was the last place she wanted to be right now. The apartment felt like a trap, its walls closing in on her, each moment spent there weighing heavier than the last. She couldn't stay there, not now. Not with the fear creeping through her veins like ice, freezing her thoughts, keeping her from thinking clearly. Every time she tried to make sense of what was happening, the answers slipped through her fingers, like smoke, dissipating before she could grasp them. She looked at her phone again. There was nothing on the screen now, just a faint glow from the background. She thought about calling someone, anyone, to talk about what was happening, but who could she turn to? Who would believe her? Her friends, her family, none of them would understand. They would tell her she was overreacting, that it was just a prank, that she was imagining things. But deep inside, she knew the truth. This was no prank. This was real. And whatever was behind these calls, whatever force was pulling the strings, it was far darker than anything she could have imagined. The path before her seemed to stretch endlessly, the flickering streetlights casting long, eerie shadows on the pavement. She had been walking for what felt like hours, though she hadn't kept track of time. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay still, couldn't stay in one place for too long. Her thoughts were too loud, too frantic, and her body felt like it was vibrating with the energy of it all, as though she were on the edge of something she wasn't prepared to face. Her feet led her to a small, quiet street she hadn't seen before, a street that seemed untouched by time. The houses were old, their windows dark, their doors closed. There was an eerie stillness here, as though no one had lived on this street in years, as though it had been abandoned long ago. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she walked further down the road, her footsteps the only sound breaking the silence. She could feel the weight of the night pressing against her, the shadows growing longer with each step she took. She came to a stop in front of one of the houses, its porch light dim and flickering. Something about it felt familiar, though she couldn't place why. It was as if she had been here before, but in another time, another life. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, the kind of tension that lingers before something terrible happens. Her breath quickened, the pulse in her neck pounding in time with her racing heart. Without thinking, she stepped up onto the porch, her hand reaching out to touch the railing. It was cold to the touch, the wood rough under her fingers. As she stepped closer to the door, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A single word, scrawled in what looked like chalk, etched across the doorframe. Remember. The word was simple, yet it sent a shock through her body, freezing her in place. Her mouth went dry, and the breath caught in her chest. She didn't know what to make of it, but she knew one thing for certain: this was no coincidence. This was the same message, the same word that had haunted her mind ever since the first phone call. Remember. It was as though it had been carved into her soul, a command she couldn't ignore, a reminder of something she had lost, something she had buried deep within herself. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the door. It was old, the wood creaking under her touch, but it didn't give way. The door was locked. Emily stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. Something in her told her that she needed to go inside, that she needed to see what lay behind that door, but fear gripped her tightly, holding her in place. She couldn't leave. She couldn't leave without answers. She stepped back, her eyes scanning the house as if searching for something that might give her a clue. The windows were all dark, the curtains drawn, the house seemingly abandoned. But she could feel something. A presence. A weight. The feeling of being watched. Her heart pounded harder as the wind picked up, a sudden gust sweeping through the street, rustling the leaves and making the trees sway. And then, just as she was about to turn away, the front door creaked open. Emily froze. She hadn't heard anyone approach. There was no sound, no sign of movement, but the door was open now, just a crack, enough to reveal a sliver of darkness beyond. She stood there, rooted to the spot, her mind racing. This was it. This was the moment. The one she had been dreading, the one she had known would come. She could feel the pull of it, the gravitational force that was drawing her in, pushing her forward, into the unknown. Her feet moved before her mind could catch up, carrying her closer to the door, and without thinking, she stepped inside. The air inside the house was musty, thick with the smell of dust and decay. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she slowly made her way through the hallway, her senses on high alert. There was no light here, no warmth, just the oppressive weight of the dark that seemed to stretch on forever. Every step she took felt like a step into the unknown, a step further into a nightmare she couldn't escape. She reached the living room, and the sight before her made her blood run cold. The room was furnished, but everything was covered in sheets, old, tattered sheets that hung over furniture like ghosts. The dust in the air danced in the faint light that filtered in from the cracked windows, the room heavy with the smell of abandonment. But it was the picture on the wall that caught her attention. She didn't know why, but her eyes were drawn to it, like magnets pulling her in. The photo was old, its edges yellowed with age, and it was of a family, 2 parents, a young girl, and a boy. The family looked familiar, but Emily couldn't place where she had seen them before. And then she saw it. The boy in the photo was Michael. Her heart skipped a beat as she stumbled backward, her mind racing. This couldn't be possible. Michael had disappeared years ago, and yet, here he was, in a photo that should have been decades old. The walls felt like they were closing in around her. She could hear her own breathing now, shallow and quick, the sound too loud in the silence of the room. Her mind was spinning. What was happening? Why was Michael in this picture? Why was this house connected to him? And why was it all coming back now? The phone in her pocket vibrated again, startling her. Her hand shook as she pulled it out, almost afraid to look at the screen. Another unknown number. She hesitated, but only for a moment. The fear and curiosity battling inside her were too strong. She answered the call. "Emily," the voice whispered, almost lovingly. "It's time to remember." The line went dead. Emily stood motionless, the phone still pressed to her ear. The voice on the other end had been soft, almost tender, but the words it had spoken had sent a shock through her entire body. "It's time to remember." Her heart raced, her chest tightening with a sudden wave of panic. She had never been more terrified in her life, yet she couldn't tear herself away from the call, couldn't bring herself to hang up. It was as though the voice was pulling her in, wrapping around her like a vine, tightening with every passing second. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, suffocating her as she stood frozen, the words echoing in her mind. Time felt like it had slowed to a crawl. Her senses were heightened, her thoughts fragmented. She could hear her own breathing, shallow and erratic, and yet everything else felt silent. It was like the world outside her apartment had faded away, leaving only the voice on the other end of the line, its presence filling the space like a weight she couldn't escape. Her fingers trembled against the phone, the vibrations from the call still humming through her hand. "Who are you?" she whispered, the question coming out of her throat before she even had time to think. She hadn't wanted to ask, but she had to know. She needed to know who was tormenting her, who was playing this cruel game with her mind. The silence on the other end of the line stretched on for what felt like an eternity before the voice responded, its tone colder now, sharper. "You already know who I am, Emily. You've always known. You've just been too afraid to remember." The words hit her like a slap to the face, a cold rush of realization flooding her system. She closed her eyes, shaking her head, trying to fight it, but she couldn't deny it. The voice was right. Deep down, she had always known. She had always known that something was wrong, that something had happened, something she had buried in the darkest corners of her mind. But she had never wanted to face it. She had pushed it away for years, trying to move on, to pretend it never happened. And now, here it was, dragging itself back into the light, forcing her to confront the truth she had been running from. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely audible, as if speaking any louder might shatter her already fragile grasp on reality. "What do you want from me?" There was a pause, a long stretch of silence that seemed to hang in the air, thick with the weight of unspoken answers. And then, the voice spoke again, its words slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. "You took something from me, Emily. Something that can never be returned. And now it's your turn to pay." The coldness in the voice sent a shiver down her spine, a chill that seeped into her bones. She took a step back, her legs trembling beneath her as though they were no longer her own. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in around her, and for the first time since this whole nightmare had started, Emily felt truly, utterly helpless. She had always thought that she could control things, that she could handle whatever life threw her way, but now she understood. She was powerless. Her breath came in short, frantic gasps as she tried to process what the voice was saying. She had taken something from it? Something that could never be returned? The words didn't make sense. She had done nothing. She hadn't hurt anyone. At least, that's what she thought. But the voice seemed certain, and that certainty made her blood run cold. What had she done? What had she forgotten? The phone in her hand vibrated again, snapping her out of her spiraling thoughts. The caller ID was blocked, but it didn't matter. She didn't need to see the number to know who was calling. She answered it immediately, unable to stop herself. Emily, the voice said, this time softer, almost sympathetic. You still don't remember, do you? She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing, but the lump in her throat made it nearly impossible. Remember what? She asked, her voice trembling with desperation. What do you want from me? The voice paused, and when it spoke again, it was almost gentle, as if it were speaking to a child. You'll remember soon enough. You'll remember everything, every detail. But it's too late for regrets now. Tears welled up in her eyes as the words hit her like a physical blow. Too late for regrets? What did that mean? What had she done? The floodgates were starting to open, memories she had locked away for years rising to the surface, but they were fragmented, broken pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite piece together. She had to know. She had to know what was going on, but the answers seemed just out of reach, slipping through her fingers like water. The harder she tried to hold on, the more elusive they became. She felt the walls of her apartment closing in on her, the shadows growing longer, the air growing colder. It felt as though something was creeping up behind her, something she couldn't see, couldn't fully understand. She wasn't alone. She never had been. Emily, the voice interrupted her spiraling thoughts, sharp and insistent. Look behind you. The words were like a command, a forceful tug that pulled her out of the haze of fear she was drowning in. Slowly, almost mechanically, she turned around. Her eyes scanned the dimly lit room, looking for anything unusual, anything that didn't belong. But there was nothing. Just the familiar surroundings of her apartment. The couch, the coffee table, the lamps. The quiet hum of the refrigerator. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then she saw it. A shadow. Small at first, but growing, stretching, pulling itself into the corner of the room. Her heart skipped a beat. It was like something was moving in the darkness, something that shouldn't be there. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as her eyes locked onto it, her pulse racing in her ears. The shadow was growing larger, shifting in a way that made no sense, as though it were being molded, shaped by something unseen. The voice on the other end of the phone spoke again, its tone filled with a strange satisfaction. Do you see it, Emily? Do you see what you've brought into this world? She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could do was stare, frozen in terror, as the shadow seemed to grow even more defined, more real. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was something else. Something she couldn't understand, something that shouldn't exist. She couldn't move. She couldn't look away. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow dissipated, vanishing into thin air. The room was still, silent. But the feeling of dread remained, clinging to the air like smoke. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. She had seen something real. Something she wasn't supposed to see. The voice spoke again, softer this time, as though it were speaking to her soul. You're closer now, Emily. The truth is just within your reach. But beware, some truths are more dangerous than lies. The line went dead once more, leaving Emily standing alone in her apartment, her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of the unknown pressing against her. She had no idea what was happening to her, what she had uncovered, or why it was happening now. But one thing was certain, she was no longer in control. Whatever had been awakened, whatever she had brought back, it was far beyond her understanding, and it was coming for her. The room felt suffocating now, the walls pressing in around her as Emily stood in the center of her apartment, her hands still gripping the phone, which now felt like a foreign object, heavy and cold in her palm. The silence after the call was almost worse than the conversation itself, deafening in its stillness, pregnant with the unease that had begun to swallow her whole. She stood there, motionless, her mind scrambling to piece together what had just happened. The shadow, the voice, It was all too much, too fast. Her thoughts felt fragmented, a shattered mirror of the reality she once knew. The coldness of the air seemed to seep deeper into her skin, and she wrapped her arms tightly around herself, trying to chase away the goosebumps that crawled along her arms. She had been alone in this apartment for years, and yet, never had she felt so exposed, so vulnerable. It was as though something had broken through the very fabric of her life, something dark and ancient, and now it was watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. She moved slowly, her footsteps quiet but deliberate, unsure of where she was even headed. Her body seemed to be on autopilot, her legs carrying her to the living room window, where the city lights stretched out before her like a vast ocean of glowing pinpricks. The world outside seemed so far away, so disconnected from the terror that had unfolded inside her home. But even the peacefulness of the night seemed to mock her. It was all wrong. The silence, the shadows, the oppressive air, it wasn't just her mind playing tricks on her. Something was coming. Something that had been waiting for this moment. Her eyes wandered to the clock on the wall. It was late, far too late for her to still be awake. But sleep was a distant thought, an impossible escape. The voice had made sure of that. It's time to remember. The words hung in the air, as if they were written into the very atmosphere of the room. She had been living with the pain of that forgotten memory for years, buried so deep that she had convinced herself it wasn't important, that it didn't matter. But now it was surfacing, rising like an unrelenting tide, pulling her under, forcing her to confront whatever it was she had buried. A part of her didn't want to know. A part of her wished she could turn back time, erase the phone call, shut herself away from whatever had been lurking in the dark corners of her life. But the other part of her, the part that had always sought the truth, couldn't ignore it. She had to know. She had to understand why this was happening to her, why she had been chosen to bear the weight of whatever had been awakened. Her eyes flicked to the photo on the mantel, the one that had been there for years, untouched, always a silent reminder of the life she had lost. It was a picture of her and Michael, back before everything changed. They were standing in the park, smiling, the sun shining brightly overhead, capturing a moment of perfect innocence. She hadn't looked at it in years, too painful, too full of memories she wasn't ready to face. But now, with the voice still echoing in her ears, it felt like the only clue she had left. Michael had been there. He had been part of her past, part of the life she had tried to forget. And yet, he was also part of the mystery that had taken over her present. She picked up the photo carefully, her fingers brushing the glass, the picture almost seeming to pulse with energy in her hands. She couldn't help but stare at it, feeling a strange sense of disconnection, like it belonged to someone else. A person she used to be. A life she had long since abandoned. But as her gaze lingered on the photograph, something in her shifted. A small detail, barely noticeable, caught her eye. It was the faintest of shadows, just behind Michael, in the far corner of the photo, something that didn't belong. It was too subtle to notice at first, but now it felt like the key to everything. Her pulse quickened as she leaned in closer, inspecting the shadow more closely. It was distorted, almost as if something, or someone, had been lurking just out of frame, a figure hidden in plain sight. She felt a chill creep up her spine as she realized what she was seeing. This wasn't just an innocent photo. It was a snapshot of something darker, something she hadn't been able to comprehend. The figure in the corner of the photo, though faint, was unmistakably human, its eyes wide, staring directly at the camera, at her. The realization hit her like a freight train. Michael had never been alone. He had been followed. Or worse, he had been taken. The photograph, this moment frozen in time, was more than a memory. It was a warning, and it was connected to everything. The phone calls, the shadows, the sense that something was always just out of reach, watching, waiting. Her hand shook as she set the photo back on the mantel. She stepped back, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts as she tried to process the overwhelming flood of thoughts that crashed into her mind. She needed to think. She needed to figure out what was happening. But every time she tried to put the pieces together, they slipped away, just out of reach, like fragments of a dream that vanished the moment she tried to hold on to them. Then the phone rang again. Her stomach dropped at the sound, the familiar vibration in her hand sending a jolt of adrenaline through her veins. She didn't have to look at the caller ID to know who it was. She answered immediately, her voice tight with the fear she could no longer conceal. "Emily," the voice purred, its tone almost mocking. "I told you you would remember. You would remember everything." The words wrapped around her like a noose, choking her breath. She clutched the phone harder, as if somehow that would stop the nightmare from unfolding. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" "But..." The voice paused for a moment, almost as if considering its answer. When it spoke again, it was colder, more sinister. "You've always known, Emily. You've always known that you were never meant to forget. And now you will remember everything. Every moment. Every detail. But it will cost you." "Cost me?" Her voice cracked and she swallowed hard. "What do you mean, cost me?" "You'll understand soon enough," the voice replied, the amusement dripping from its words. "You see, Emily, when you choose to bury the truth, when you decide to lock it away and pretend it never happened, you make a bargain. You make a deal with forces you cannot control. And now the time has come to pay the price." A sharp, cold laugh echoed in her ear before the line went dead again, leaving her in the silent void of her apartment, her mind reeling. The words hung in the air, pressing against her chest, each syllable like a weight too heavy to bear. What price? What had she done? What had she forgotten? The sense of dread was overwhelming now, suffocating her in the dark. It wasn't just the shadow in the photograph or the cryptic words from the voice. It was the feeling that something was very wrong, that her reality was shifting beneath her feet, crumbling away. The world outside was still there, but it felt farther away than it ever had before, as though the universe itself was shifting in ways she couldn't see, couldn't understand. Emily sank to her knees in the middle of the room, her hands clutching her head as though the pressure in her mind was about to explode. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew it was only getting worse. The memories, the shadows, the fear, it was all consuming her now, all pulling her into a world she wasn't ready for. And then, in the midst of the darkness, she felt it. A presence, not just in the room but in her own mind, a force that had been waiting, patiently, to make itself known. It was coming,